Early Years, from The Raven of Zürich, the Memoirs of Felix Somary, by Felix Somary. Podcast read by Archie Henderson. I was born in Vienna on the 20th of November 1881 to Dr. Simon Somary, an imperial and high court advocate, and his wife Fanny. I was their sixth child. The four older ones had died of diphtheria, which was then incurable. The fifth child, my sister Ella, and later the seventh, my sister Paula, were bound to me throughout our lives in the closest intimacy. They had learned from our parents what family can really mean. The tacit understanding characteristic of genuine families, that in all life's vicissitudes one considers first others and only then one's own needs. Those who have experienced family life of this kind are fortunate indeed. It brings a deep happiness that nothing else can replace. The inner city, the ancient center of Vienna, surrounded by a wall until the third quarter of the 19th century, had barely 60,000 inhabitants in my youth, but it contained the government buildings of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Supreme Court, the university, and leading arts institutions. Everything outside the centre was known as Vorstadt, the suburbs, which almost meant the same as provinces. Aside from certain residential quarters containing substantial detached villas, the Vorstadt was the home of trade and industry and working-class dwellings. The arts, sciences, professions, and bureaucracy were all concentrated in the center of Vienna, and almost a quarter of that was taken up by the Kaiserburg, with its courtyards, gardens, and great art galleries. When we were children, our favorite places to play were the vast square in front of the Burg and its adjacent Volksgarten. Before I was 10, my sisters and I were keenly interested in what went on in the other buildings. The complex of buildings, known collectively as Hofburg, contained a group of art and scholarly institutions that, for the supreme value of their collections, their historical significance, and the quality of their cultural contributions, were scarcely equalled anywhere in the world. There was the treasure chamber, Schatzkammer, with the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. Further along to the left, the court chapel, Hofkapelle, in which the most beautiful sacred music, which I can still hear in memory, was performed each Sunday. Still further was the Spanish riding school, which surely belongs among the art institutions, for here a sport was transmuted into art. In the adjacent Josefplatz there stood Fischer von Erlach's masterpiece, the imposing library building with its splendid reading room and choice collection of volumes. Then came the Albertina, with its unique collection of drawings and prints, and finally the opera, which, at that time under Hans Richter, Richard Wagner's collaborator, and later under Gustav Mahler, put on productions of unparalleled beauty. In the southern wing of the complex were the art and natural sciences collections. In the west wing, the Schauspielhaus and the Burgtheater, whose Shakespeare productions remained unforgettable for 2 generations. From the time we were 10 years old, my sisters and I were planted at least 3 times a week in the standing room section at one or other of these theatres, and saw the masterpieces of all nations in the most outstanding productions. Never since have I encountered more enthusiastic or more critical audiences. All these extraordinary riches seemed to us part of daily life, since they were in the immediate vicinity of our home. Our parents first introduced us to all this, and then, at an early stage, drew our attention to the essence, to the best. Thanks to them, we saw the original of Dürer's Green Passion, and not a copy which was shown to other visitors. If permitted to see this, one really ought to kneel, my father said to me at the time. We learned quite early to value quality. We were able to enjoy all this splendor to the full, and in most places almost alone, because, except for the theatre, most of the Viennese didn't bother about the other superb treasures they could so easily have enjoyed. After 4 years of elementary school, the 5th I was allowed to skip, I enrolled at the Schotten Gymnasium in Vienna, a justly famed school run by the Benedictine order, considered the best secondary school in Austria. The curriculum was broad, with particular attention to Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and natural sciences. Partly in school and partly at home, we read almost all the Roman and Greek classics, and tackled middle-high German literature in our German studies. The Burgtheater filled in our knowledge of English, French, and Spanish literature. Since I did not want to be a total financial burden on my parents, I started at 14 tutoring in Greek, mathematics, and history, so that I can now look back on a working life of 60 years. I tutored my students at their homes, as was then the custom, on my 2 free afternoons, Wednesdays and Saturdays. My remuneration of 1 krone per hour, equivalent to 1 Swiss franc, but with much more purchasing power, was modest, but then school fees were also low. Insofar as his schedule permitted, my father took part in all my studies, and through him, history and the old classics came alive for me. I still remember his unique interpretation of Catiline, and when nowadays I drive by Terni, I go up to Amelia in order to think in that unequalled landscape about Cicero's defense of Roscius Amerinus and my father's commentary. How few students understand this book. Most of them torture themselves in boredom with Cicero's vocabulary. Once at supper, I mentioned Cicero's statement, If my client is condemned, it would be better to go among the wild beasts than to go on living in this slough of Romulus. I said that this was an impossible sentence. Thereupon my father answered me, "Do you know what it was all about? When Sulla undertook to outlaw the Democratic Party, and each informer was promised the property of his enemy, one of his followers murdered a property owner in Amelia, and denounced the victim's own son as the murderer. Without Cicero's defense, the innocent son would have been condemned. Therefore, nothing in those words is exaggerated. The language was necessary because of the lawlessness of those times, and indicated the quite rare courage of the defense counsel, who is often otherwise criticized for lack of courage." My mother remarked that such a thing would be impossible today, anywhere in the world. "Don't say that," rejoined my father. "What happened at the height of Roman civilization can repeat itself in our time. The struggle between brute force and justice is not over by a long shot." How clearly I can still see everything in my parental home. Even stern warnings and sharp criticisms played their part in shaping my character. One day, when I was 12 years old, our old shoemaker, Cresci, was measuring me for shoes, old style, kneeling on the ground, and spoke to me in his Czech German. I imitated him in the same intonation. My father heard it through the open door, called me into his office, and for the first and only time in my life gave me a resounding slap. "How dare you make fun of that man, insulting him for his own language, the most sacred thing he has on earth? Can you speak his language? How would you feel if you were mocked by one of the natives in some foreign country because of your accent? Leave this sort of meanness to ordinary people. It's to separate you from them that you are attending the gymnasium." Deeply ashamed, I apologized to the shoemaker. From that moment on, I was immune to the virus of nationalism.